Look at her face!
Imagine standing in a high school cafeteria, surrounded by hundreds of students, when suddenly a full tray of food comes flying through the air. Mashed potatoes, thick brown gravy, green beans, all of it sailing toward one target. The cafeteria falls completely silent. Every phone comes out, recording. And there she stands, a black woman in her 50s wearing a simple lunch lady uniform, food dripping from her hair, down her face, soaking into her clothes. The 17-year-old boy who threw it, Trevor Hastings, wealthy, athletic, popular, is doubled over laughing with his friends. They're recording too, already planning which social media platform will get the views. But if you looked closely at that lunch lady's face, you wouldn't see tears. You wouldn't see rage. You'd see something else entirely. Something calculating. Something knowing. Because Trevor Hastings and his crew had absolutely no idea who they just humiliated. They had no idea who she really was. But to understand how we got to that moment, we need to rewind 3 days. 3 days earlier, Margaret Williams sat at the head of a polished mahogany table in a corporate boardroom on the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise. At 52 years old, Margaret commanded attention without raising her voice. Her silver-gray hair was styled perfectly. Her tailored suit spoke of success. And the nameplate in front of her read CO, Hastings Educational Services. Margaret had built this company from nothing. Hastings Educational Services managed school food programs across 47 districts in 3 states. They served over 200,000 students every single day. Margaret knew every contract, every menu, every health code by heart. Because she hadn't started in a boardroom. She'd started in a cafeteria kitchen. That morning, the quarterly reports were spread across the table, and one school kept appearing in the complaints. Lincoln High School. The numbers were alarming. Food waste had increased by 37%. Staff turnover was at an all-time high. 3 lunch ladies had quit in 6 months. And the complaints painted a disturbing picture. Students throwing food. Staff being verbally abused. A toxic environment that nobody seemed able to control. Margaret's district manager for that region, Richard Chin, sat across from her, confident and dismissive. He insisted everything was under control. Just typical high school drama. Kids being kids. The supervisor on site, Karen Dempsey, had assured him personally that the situation was exaggerated. Richard had charts, graphs, metrics that technically met company standards. But Margaret had spent 30 years learning to read between the lines. And something was very, very wrong at Lincoln High School. Margaret grew up in poverty. Real poverty. The kind where you wear the same pair of shoes until they fall apart, then keep wearing them. The kind where free school lunch isn't just convenient, it's survival. She remembered being that hungry kid, the one other students mocked for wearing her older brother's hand-me-downs. She remembered the shame of it, the way it carved itself into your bones and stayed there. But she also remembered the cafeteria workers who showed her kindness. Particularly one woman, Miss Patterson, who always made sure Margaret got enough to eat, who treated her with dignity when no one else did. Margaret worked as a lunch lady to put herself through community college. She took out loans for her bachelor's degree. She learned food service management, business administration, contract law. She worked 18-hour days. She built Hastings Educational Services from a single school contract to an empire. And she did it because she never forgot what it felt like to be invisible. To be dismissed. To be hungry. So when Richard Chin tried to convince her that Lincoln High School was fine, that the complaints were overblown, Margaret made a decision. She was going undercover. She would see the truth with her own eyes. Richard looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Board members exchanged concerned glances. But Margaret was adamant. She needed to know what was really happening in that cafeteria. And she needed to know now. That evening, Margaret stood in her spacious bathroom at home, a box of hair dye in her hands. She covered her distinguished gray hair with a darker brown, watching her reflection transform. She pulled out clothes she'd bought that afternoon from a discount store. Plain black pants. A simple shirt. Comfortable shoes worn enough to look lived in. Her assistant, James, a sharp 28-year-old who'd worked with Margaret for 5 years, stood in the doorway expressing every concern imaginable. What if she got hurt? What if someone recognized her? What if the situation was actually dangerous? Margaret understood his worry, but this wasn't negotiable. She'd spent 3 decades in boardrooms, reading reports, trusting other people's observations. But reports didn't tell you everything. Numbers didn't capture the human cost. She needed to feel it, see it, experience it herself. As she looked at her reflection, now significantly more ordinary, less polished, she noticed an old photograph tucked into the corner of her mirror. It showed a young woman, barely 22, in a lunch lady uniform, smiling despite the exhaustion in her eyes. That was her. 30 years ago. Working the morning shift before classes, the evening shift after. Margaret picked up the photograph, studied it carefully, and said something that would stay with James for years to come. Some things you never forget. And some things you simply can't let continue. She knew what it felt like to be powerless. And she'd sworn, back when she had nothing but student debt and determination, that if she ever had power, she'd use it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The next morning, Margaret Williams became Maggie Wilson. She drove her oldest car, a 10-year-old sedan she'd kept for sentimental reasons, to Lincoln High School. She parked in the employee lot and walked through the service entrance at 6 in the morning, just as the cafeteria staff was arriving for breakfast prep. The kitchen was older than she expected, equipment that should have been replaced years ago. The floors were clean but worn. And the atmosphere was tense. Karen Dempsey, the supervisor, was exactly what Margaret expected from the reports. 48 years old, permanently irritated expression, the kind of middle manager who'd stopped caring about the work years ago and now just protected her position. Karen's orientation for the new lunch lady was rushed and dismissive. She handed Margaret a hairnet, an apron, and a 20-minute overview of procedures that should have taken 2 hours. Karen made subtle comments about Margaret being older, questioned whether she could keep up with the pace, implied that this job might be too demanding for someone her age. Margaret said nothing. She watched. She observed. She absorbed every detail. The expired milk in the walk-in cooler that should have been thrown out 3 days ago. The portions being cut smaller than the district requirements. The broken dishwasher that staff had apparently been reporting for 2 months. And the way Karen spoke to students during breakfast service, with barely concealed contempt. But Margaret also met the staff who actually cared. Dolores was 63, Latina, with kind eyes that had seen too much. She'd worked at Lincoln High for 28 years. She moved slowly now, her back bothering her, but she knew every student by name. She remembered their allergies, their preferences, their stories. Kevin was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in education, working this job temporarily while he figured out his next move. He was idealistic, still believed the system could work, still thought reporting problems would solve them. And Shanice was 31, a single mother of 2, who took this job because the hours worked with her kid's school schedule. She was terrified of losing it. Margaret could see the fear in Shanice's eyes every time Karen spoke to her. During a quiet moment in the morning, Dolores pulled Margaret aside. Her voice was low, tired, resigned. She told Margaret something that would become painfully clear over the coming days. Just keep your head down. That's how we survive here. Don't ask questions. Don't challenge anything. Don't try to change things. Because people who tried to make things better didn't last. They got pushed out, written up for minor infractions, eventually forced to quit. The message was clear. This was a place where good people learned to be silent. Then lunch service began, and Margaret saw exactly what the reports had been trying to tell her. The cafeteria filled with students, hundreds of them, loud and energetic the way teenagers are. Margaret took her position behind the serving line, scooping portions, handing out trays. And she watched. She observed the social dynamics, the hierarchies, the cruelty that adults often don't notice because it's so normalized. The cafeteria had its ecosystems, its food chains, its predators and prey. Trevor Hastings arrived like royalty. 17 years old, white, athletic build, wearing a varsity jacket that probably cost more than Dolores made in a week. He had that confidence that comes from never being told no, never facing consequences, never having to consider anyone else's feelings. His crew followed behind him. They didn't wait in line. They just walked to the front, cutting past students who'd been waiting patiently. When Shanice, working the register, politely told them they needed to wait like everyone else, Trevor didn't yell. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he made a comment loaded with racist undertones, questioning whether she even understood how the school worked, suggesting she was probably new to this country and didn't understand American customs. Shanice's face crumbled. Just for a moment, her hurt was visible. Then she put her head down and let them through. Kevin, the young idealistic one, stepped forward to intervene. Trevor turned to him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said something that silenced him immediately. He'd get Kevin fired. One phone call to his father and Kevin would be gone. And the worst part? Everyone knew Trevor could do it. Everyone knew he had that power. Margaret served Trevor his food with a completely neutral expression. But behind her eyes, something was happening. She was recording everything. Every word, every gesture, every face in that cafeteria who looked away because they knew intervening was pointless. Marcus Johnson caught Margaret's attention immediately. 16 years old, black, quiet in the way kids get when they've learned that speaking up only brings more pain. He was a scholarship student, which Margaret learned later, here on academic merit in a school full of wealth he'd never have. He waited patiently in line, thanked Margaret when she served him, and took his tray to eat alone outside on a bench. Amy Chin, 15, Asian American, looked perpetually anxious. She was a people-pleaser, trying to be invisible, trying not to attract the wrong attention. And Jessica Rodriguez, 17, Latina, beautiful, was Trevor's girlfriend. But Margaret noticed something in Jessica's eyes. Conflict. Doubt. Like she was starting to realize the boy she was dating wasn't who she thought he was. After the lunch rush ended and the cafeteria emptied, Margaret took her break. She found Marcus outside eating alone, his lunch pathetically small. A sandwich that looked homemade from whatever was left in the fridge. An apple that had seen better days. Water from the fountain. Margaret approached him carefully, holding a sandwich wrapped in plastic. She told him she'd made it by mistake, had to throw it out anyway. Would he want it? Marcus looked at her with suspicion first. In his world, adults didn't just give you things without wanting something back. But he was hungry. Really hungry. The kind of hungry Margaret remembered from her own childhood. So he accepted it. They sat together, not saying much at first. Then slowly, carefully, Marcus opened up. His family was struggling. His mom worked 2 jobs, but it was never quite enough. He was at Lincoln High on an academic scholarship, full ride based on his test scores. He was brilliant. But being brilliant didn't protect you from Trevor Hastings and his crew. Margaret asked the question she already knew the answer to. Why didn't he report the bullying? Marcus actually laughed, bitter and knowing beyond his 16 years. He told her she must be new here. Nobody cared. Nobody did anything. Because Trevor's father, Donald Hastings, donated $500,000 a year to the school. Donald sat on the school board. Donald had the principal's personal cell phone number. And Donald made sure his son never faced real consequences for anything. Margaret absorbed this information, filed it away in her methodical mind. This wasn't just about one bully. This was about a system that protected wealth and power while grinding down everyone else. When Margaret returned to the kitchen, she witnessed something that completed the picture. Karen Dempsey was berating Dolores for taking too long talking to students during service, accusing her of wasting time, threatening to write her up. Dolores, this woman who'd given 28 years to this school, who knew every student's name, was being humiliated for showing basic human kindness. And then Margaret saw it. Karen, when she thought no one was looking, pocketed cash from the cafeteria fund. Money that was supposed to go toward food supplies, toward better equipment, toward making this place better for students. Karen was stealing it. Not a huge amount, but steady, regular, adding up over time. The stakes became crystal clear in that moment. This wasn't just about Trevor Hastings throwing his weight around. This wasn't just about bullying. This was systematic corruption. A supervisor stealing from children. A principal protecting wealthy donors instead of vulnerable students. A culture so toxic that good people had learned the only way to survive was to keep their heads down and accept it. Margaret cleaned the kitchen in silence, but inside, her mind was working through everything she'd seen. Every violation. Every cruelty. Every failure. She'd come here suspecting problems, but this was worse than she'd imagined. Before we continue, if you're invested in seeing how Margaret handles this situation, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This story has twists you won't believe and you won't want to miss what happens next. And here's a question for you. What would you do if you witnessed this kind of corruption and bullying in your workplace or school? Would you speak up or would you keep your head down? Let me know in the comments below, because the choice Margaret faces is one we've all encountered in different forms. Margaret left Lincoln High that first day as Maggie Wilson, the quiet new lunch lady who seemed overwhelmed and ordinary. But as she drove away in her old sedan, she was already planning. Already strategizing. Already preparing for what came next. Because Margaret Williams hadn't built an empire by accepting injustice. She'd built it by fighting it. And Trevor Hastings, Karen Dempsey, and everyone else who thought this broken system was untouchable were about to learn something important. Some people underestimate the lunch lady. And that's their first mistake. Day 2 at Lincoln High School started before dawn. Margaret arrived at 5:30 in the morning, earlier than required, earlier than anyone expected from a new lunch lady still learning the ropes. But Margaret wasn't just learning the ropes. She was building trust. She helped Dolores unload the morning delivery, hauling boxes of produce and dry goods that were heavier than they looked. She asked questions, not the probing kind that raised suspicion, but the genuine curious kind that made people feel valued. And slowly, carefully, Dolores began to open up. They were in the storage room organizing canned goods, when Dolores finally said what she'd been holding back. The toxic environment at Lincoln High hadn't always been this bad. 10 years ago this cafeteria had been different. Staff cared. Students were respectful. But something had shifted. Dolores had watched 3 lunch ladies quit in just the past year. Good women, dedicated workers, people who genuinely loved feeding kids. But they couldn't take it anymore. The harassment from certain students, the way Karen protected the wealthy bullies while throwing everyone else under the bus, the constant feeling that nothing they did mattered because the system was rigged. One by one they'd broken and left. Dolores looked at Margaret with eyes that had seen too much disappointment and said something haunting. The ones who stay learn to be invisible. You don't make waves. You don't challenge anything. You just survive your shift and go home. That's how you keep this job. That's how you protect yourself. Margaret listened, absorbing every word, but inside she was furious. Not at Dolores for accepting this reality, but at a system that forced good people to make themselves small just to survive. Kevin approached them later during prep, his young face tight with frustration. He'd been holding something in too and it came pouring out. He'd reported Trevor Hastings. Twice. Official reports, following proper protocols, documenting the bullying, the racist comments, the intimidation. The first report vanished completely like it had never existed. The second one got him called into Principal Whitmore's office. Dr. Robert Whitmore, 55 years old, every inch the career administrator who cared more about politics than students. Whitmore had told Kevin, in no uncertain terms, to be more careful about making accusations against students from influential families. The reports were destroyed. And Kevin got the message. Speak up and you're the problem. Margaret filed this away, her mental case building stronger by the hour. But then Dolores mentioned something that made Margaret's blood run cold. Trevor's last name, Hastings, wasn't random. His father, Donald Hastings, sat on the school board. And Donald Hastings was the nephew of Margaret's late business partner, Gerald Hastings. Margaret had heard about Donald over the years, the spoiled heir who'd inherited wealth but not character, who'd raised his son with the same toxic entitlement. But she'd never met him, never had reason to interact with him. Until now. This was personal in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. The company bore the Hastings name because of Gerald, a good man who'd believed in using business to serve communities. And now his nephew's son was destroying the very environment Margaret's company was supposed to protect. Lunch service on day 2 was worse than day 1. Margaret watched Trevor enter the cafeteria with an extra swagger, like he'd tasted blood and wanted more. He grabbed food off his tray, mashed potatoes and rolls, and deliberately dropped them on the floor. Then he turned to Shanice and told her to clean it up. Right now. Like she was his personal servant. And he filmed it. Took out his phone and recorded Shanice on her hands and knees cleaning up the mess he'd made on purpose, while he laughed and made comments for his social media followers. Students around them reacted in different ways. Some laughed, performing for Trevor's camera, trying to be part of the joke. Others stayed silent, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Amy Chin watched from her table, clearly disturbed, her face twisted with disgust, but fear kept her frozen. Margaret served the next student in line with steady hands, but her mind was recording every detail. Every face. Every cruel laugh. Every silent bystander. After school, when the cafeteria had emptied and most staff had gone home, Margaret stayed late. She told Karen she wanted to learn the inventory system to be more helpful. Karen was suspicious but ultimately dismissed her, too confident in her own cleverness to see the threat. Margaret went through the storage room systematically. She found expired food, dairy products weeks past their safe date, being documented as fresh inventory. She found budget allocations for quality ingredients, organic produce, lean proteins, but the actual inventory was cheap, processed, barely meeting nutritional standards. The difference, the money saved by buying garbage and charging for quality, was going somewhere. And Margaret had a strong suspicion where. She photographed everything with a phone she kept hidden in her pocket. Serial numbers on expired products. Budget documents left carelessly in filing cabinets. Purchase orders that didn't match inventory. Every piece of evidence carefully captured. Then Karen walked in. The storage room suddenly felt very small. Karen's eyes narrowed, suspicious, calculating. She asked what Margaret was doing, her voice cold and sharp. Margaret played dumb, stumbling over words, claiming she was just trying to learn the system, wanted to understand how everything worked so she could be a better employee. The performance was perfect. Nervous, apologetic, slightly incompetent. Karen moved closer, invading Margaret's space in that way bullies do when they want to intimidate. She delivered a warning that was barely veiled as advice. Don't try to be a hero, Maggie. Heroes don't last long here. People who ask too many questions, who dig into things that don't concern them, they find themselves written up for minor violations. They find their hours cut. They find themselves suddenly unemployable. The message was crystal clear. Karen wasn't just negligent. She was actively, knowingly corrupt. And she knew the system protected her. Margaret apologized, backed down, played the role of the chastened employee. But inside, her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. This wasn't just about fixing problems. This was about dismantling a system that allowed people like Karen to prey on children and terrorize workers. The next day, Margaret noticed Marcus the moment he walked into the cafeteria. He had a black eye, swollen and dark purple, the kind that comes from a real punch, not an accident. He kept his head down, trying to be invisible, but Margaret saw him. During lunch service, she prepared an extra sandwich again, some fruit, a juice box, and brought it to him outside where he sat alone. Marcus took the food, but his hands were shaking. And then it all came out. The day before, after school, Trevor and his friends had cornered Marcus in the parking lot. They accused him of looking at Jessica, Trevor's girlfriend. Marcus hadn't been looking at anyone, he'd just been walking to the bus, but the accusation was enough. Trevor and 3 of his friends beat him up. Real violence, punches to the face and ribs, knocking him to the ground, kicking him while he was down. Marcus had bruises under his shirt that Margaret couldn't see but could imagine. He tried to report it. Went straight to the school resource officer, a cop assigned to the school for exactly these situations. And the resource officer, this person whose literal job was to protect students, told Marcus that boys will be boys. Suggested maybe Marcus had provoked them somehow. Made it clear that filing an official report would be more trouble than it was worth. Marcus's mother worked 2 jobs. One as a home health aide during the day, another cleaning offices at night. She barely slept. She sacrificed everything so Marcus could have opportunities she never had. And Marcus couldn't bear to worry her with this. Couldn't tell her that the scholarship that was supposed to change their lives had put him in a place where he got beaten up and nobody cared. Margaret listened to all of this, and something inside her broke open. She remembered being young, being cornered by bullies who targeted her because she was poor, because her clothes were wrong, because she was an easy victim. She remembered the fear, the shame, the suffocating helplessness of knowing that adults who were supposed to protect you would do nothing. But she also remembered Miss Patterson, the lunch lady who'd stood up for her, who'd made her feel like she mattered, who'd changed the entire trajectory of her life by showing her that someone cared. Margaret looked at Marcus, this brilliant, scared, brave 16-year-old, and asked him a question. What if I told you things could change? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just bitter knowledge beyond his years. He told her she didn't know how the world worked. And in that moment, Margaret made a decision. She was going to show him exactly how the world could work when someone with power chose to use it right. Day 3 arrived with tension thick enough to cut. The cafeteria staff could feel it. Something was building. Karen had called a morning meeting to announce budget cuts. Smaller portions, cheaper food, reduced staff hours. The staff stood there, demoralized, knowing this meant more work for less pay while feeding kids worse nutrition. Margaret watched Karen deliver this news with barely concealed satisfaction. This was power for Karen. The ability to make people's lives harder. Trevor entered the cafeteria that day like he owned it. He was extra hostile, performing for his friends, feeding off their attention. Jessica was with him, but something had changed in her. She looked troubled, withdrawn, like she was starting to see her boyfriend clearly for the first time and didn't like what she saw. Trevor made a show of approaching the serving line and immediately complaining about the food. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he declared that this slop wasn't fit for dogs. Students around him laughed on cue. Margaret calmly asked him to please move through the line so others could be served. It was a simple, reasonable request. The kind any cafeteria worker would make a dozen times a day. Trevor turned on her with theatrical outrage. Or what? You gonna report me, old lady? The cafeteria was watching now. This was becoming a show. Margaret maintained her composure and simply repeated her request. She asked him respectfully to treat the food and staff with respect. Trevor leaned in close, invading her space, his face inches from hers. And he said something that revealed everything about how he saw the world. You're just a lunch lady. You're nothing. You serve me. In Trevor's universe, people were divided into 2 categories. People who mattered and people who served. And he'd spent his entire 17 years learning that he was in the first category and people like Margaret were in the second. The cafeteria held its breath. Students had their phones out. This was the kind of confrontation that would be all over social media within minutes. What would the new lunch lady do? Would she cry? Would she yell? Would she back down? Trevor grabbed his full tray. Mashed potatoes, thick gravy, green beans, a roll, fruit. In one smooth motion, fueled by teenage cruelty and absolute confidence that he'd face no consequences, he threw it. Directly at Margaret. The tray flew through the air. Food exploded across her uniform. Mashed potatoes hit her face, gravy dripped down her hair, green beans splattered across her chest. The cafeteria gasped. Some students screamed. Others started recording immediately. Trevor's crew doubled over laughing, hysterical with the audacity of what they'd just witnessed. They were filming, commenting, already planning their social media posts. Margaret stood perfectly still. Food dripping from her face. Down her uniform. Pooling at her feet. Dolores rushed forward to help her. Kevin started toward Trevor, fists clenched. But Margaret raised one hand. "It's okay." Her voice was calm. "Steady." She looked directly at Trevor, maintaining eye contact that made him slightly uncomfortable despite his bravado. "Are you finished?" Trevor, shocked that she wasn't crying or screaming, played it off with more aggression. "Yeah, I'm finished. What are you gonna do about it?" Margaret's response was quiet, controlled, and absolutely chilling in its certainty. "I'm going to remember this moment." She turned and walked calmly to the kitchen. Not rushing. Not running. Just walking with dignity while food dripped from her hair. The students watched in confusion. They'd expected drama, tears, and adult losing control. Instead, they got something they didn't understand. Composure. Purpose. Marcus watched from his corner table, his heart breaking for this kind lunch lady who'd shown him compassion. He felt guilty, helpless, furious. This was his world. This was what happened at Lincoln High School. Good people got destroyed and bullies won. In the kitchen, the staff rallied around Margaret. Shanice was crying, apologizing, saying she should have done something, should have stopped it somehow. Margaret took Shanice's hands and looked her in the eye. "This isn't your fault. None of this is." She said it with such conviction that Shanice almost believed her. Then Karen arrived. Not to help. Not to check if Margaret was okay. But to lecture her. Karen's voice was cold, accusatory. Margaret had provoked Trevor. Students like Trevor needed to be handled carefully. She should have known better than to challenge him. Margaret looked at Karen and said something simple. "Students like Trevor need consequences." Karen's laugh was harsh and knowing. "Well, they won't get them. Trevor's father will have my job if I discipline him. Just clean yourself up and get back to work." The system was laid bare in that moment. Everyone knew the rules. Wealth and power protected their own, and everyone else could suffer. Margaret went to the bathroom and locked the door. She stood in front of the mirror looking at herself. Mashed potatoes in her hair. Gravy staining her uniform. Green beans stuck to her shoulder. For just a moment she let herself feel the humiliation, the rage, the deep exhaustion of watching injustice play out in real time. Then she pulled out her phone. The call connected immediately. James answered on the first ring, recognizing his boss's personal cell. Margaret's voice was steady, controlled, absolutely certain. "James, it's time. Activate the plan. I want the full board meeting called for tomorrow, 4 p.m. And get me everything on Donald Hastings, Dr. Whitmore, and Karen Dempsey. Everything. Financial records, emails, complaint histories, everything. If you're wondering what Margaret has planned and want to see Trevor finally face justice, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the incredible conclusion to this story. And here's my question for you. Have you ever witnessed someone in power abuse their position like this? What happened when someone finally stood up to them? Share your experiences in the comments because what's about to happen at Lincoln High School is something everyone who's ever felt powerless needs to see. Margaret washed her face carefully, methodically removing every trace of food. She looked at her reflection one more time. The gray-brown dyed hair. The plain uniform. The ordinary appearance. But her eyes held something Trevor Hastings couldn't begin to understand. Determination forged from 3 decades of building something from nothing. The absolute certainty of someone who'd spent their entire life learning to use power responsibly. And the quiet, unshakable resolve of a woman who was done watching children suffer. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow the lunch lady would disappear and the CEO would emerge. Tomorrow Trevor Hastings and everyone who'd protected him would learn a lesson they should have been taught years ago. Actions have consequences. Power has responsibilities. And underestimating someone based on their uniform, their age, their race, or their position is a mistake you only make once. Margaret left the bathroom, finished her shift, and drove home in her old sedan. But she wasn't Maggie Wilson anymore in her mind. She was Margaret Williams. And she was about to remind an entire school system exactly what justice looked like when someone with actual power decided to use it. That evening, while Lincoln High School sat empty and dark, Margaret's real office blazed with light. The 32nd floor conference room of Hastings Educational Services looked like a war room. James had assembled a team of investigators, lawyers, accountants, and HR specialists. They'd been working since Margaret's phone call, and now, past midnight, the table was covered with documents, laptops, tablets, evidence compiled with ruthless efficiency. Financial records showed Karen Dempsey's embezzlement in stark detail. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here and there, easy to miss in monthly budgets. But over 3 years, it added up to over $47,000. Money meant for children's nutrition, for quality ingredients, for kitchen equipment repairs, stolen and pocketed. The paper trail was meticulous. Every fraudulent invoice, every inflated purchase order, every pocket of cash that never made it to deposit. Karen had been so confident in her protection, so certain nobody was watching, that she'd barely tried to hide it. The documentation of ignored bullying reports was even more damning. James had obtained records through legal channels that Margaret's position allowed. 127 bullying reports filed at Lincoln High School over the past 2 years. 127 incidents documented by teachers, staff, even students brave enough to come forward. And what happened to those reports? They disappeared into Dr. Whitmore's office and were never processed. Never investigated. Never acted upon. Some were literally shredded. Others were filed in a drawer marked pending review, that apparently meant ignore forever. The investigation team had tracked down and interviewed 3 former lunch ladies who'd quit Lincoln High in the past year. Their testimonies were heartbreaking and consistent. A culture of fear. Students who faced no consequences for cruelty. A supervisor who protected wealthy bullies while throwing workers under the bus. Each woman described the same breaking point, the moment they realized that staying meant sacrificing their dignity and their mental health. One woman, Patricia Gonzalez, had worked in school cafeterias for 15 years before Lincoln High destroyed her love for the job. She'd quit without another position lined up because she literally couldn't face one more day of that environment. Evidence of Donald Hastings using his school board position to protect Trevor was documented in email chains, meeting minutes, phone records. Every time Trevor faced potential discipline, Donald intervened. He'd threaten budget cuts, suggest the school might lose his generous donations, hint that certain administrators might find their contracts not renewed. He wielded his wealth like a weapon, and Dr. Whitmore had caved every single time. Trevor had learned from his father that money could buy immunity from consequences. And for 17 years, that lesson had been reinforced over and over. Dr. Whitmore's failure to enforce anti-bullying policies was particularly egregious because the district had clear requirements. State law mandated specific protocols. The district handbook outlined exact procedures. Whitmore had ignored all of it. Not out of ignorance but out of calculation. He decided that protecting wealthy donors was more important than protecting vulnerable students. It was a choice he'd made consciously, repeatedly, systematically. Margaret reviewed everything in her real office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the one with her name on the door and her accomplishments on the walls. She was back in her element. Hair styled in its natural distinguished gray. A sharp charcoal suit that spoke of authority and success. Reading glasses perched on her nose as she went through page after page of evidence. This was who she really was. Not Maggie Wilson, the humble lunch lady. But Margaret Williams, CO, the woman who'd built an empire and wasn't about to let it be destroyed by corruption and cruelty. She held a video call with her legal team and HR director. Faces on the screen from different cities, all pulled into emergency consultation. Margaret's voice was clear and commanding. We're not just fixing one school. We're sending a message across all 47 districts. This stops now. This stops everywhere. If it's happening at Lincoln High, it's probably happening elsewhere. We audit every location. We review every complaint. We implement zero-tolerance policies for staff corruption and bullying. Every district manager, every supervisor, every single person who represents this company will understand that this behavior ends today. Her legal counsel asked about potential lawsuits, public relations concerns, the risk of exposing problems publicly. Margaret's response was immediate. I don't care about the publicity. I care about the kids. We face lawsuits, we face them. If we take a hit in the press, we take it. But we do the right thing. Always. That's not negotiable. The team worked through the night, preparing documents, building cases, organizing evidence. By morning they had everything ready. A complete dossier on Karen Dempsey for criminal prosecution. A comprehensive report on Dr. Whitmore for the district board. Documentation of Donald Hastings' interference for the state education board. And video footage from cafeteria security cameras that showed Trevor's behavior in stark, undeniable detail. Day 4 at Lincoln High School began like any other. Or so it seemed. Margaret drove her old sedan to the employee parking lot, walked through the service entrance at 6 in the morning, put on her hairnet and apron. The staff was shocked to see her. After what happened yesterday, after the humiliation of having a tray of food thrown at her, everyone assumed she'd quit. Nobody would have blamed her. Dolores approached her immediately, concern written across her weathered face. Honey, after yesterday no one would blame you for walking away. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to take that kind of abuse. Margaret smiled, warm and genuine, and said something that surprised everyone. I'm not going anywhere. There was something in her voice, a certainty that made Dolores look at her more closely. But Margaret just went about her work, helping with breakfast prep, serving students, cleaning up like it was any normal day. Trevor entered the cafeteria that morning expecting to see Margaret broken, cowering, maybe not there at all. Instead, she was at her station, serving breakfast with a slight smile on her face. It unnerved him. He'd thrown food at her face. He'd humiliated her in front of hundreds of students. The videos had gotten thousands of views online. She should be devastated. But she looked almost pleased. Trevor approached the serving line with his usual swagger, but something was off. He tried to provoke her with a question. What are you smiling about? Margaret's response was simple and mysterious. Just glad to be here. It's an important day. Trevor didn't know what to make of that. His friends laughed it off, but even they seemed unsettled by her calm demeanor. Lunch service proceeded normally, but small things were changing in the cafeteria ecosystem. Margaret noticed Amy Chin, the anxious 15-year-old who'd always stayed silent, approach Marcus Johnson at his lonely table. Amy was trembling, clearly terrified, but she sat down next to him and said something quiet. Marcus looked shocked. Margaret couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw Amy's face, saw her apologize for not standing up for him, for being too scared to do the right thing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Small acts of courage beginning to appear in an environment that had crushed courage for years. Jessica Rodriguez confronted Trevor quietly during lunch, pulling him aside away from his crew. Margaret watched Jessica's body language, the way she stood firm despite Trevor's dismissiveness. Jessica told him what he'd done to Margaret yesterday was wrong. Seriously wrong. Trevor's response was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd never learned accountability. Don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke. Can't you take a joke? But Jessica's face showed she was done accepting that excuse. Something was shifting in Trevor's world, even if he couldn't see it yet. At 3:30 that afternoon, Principal Whitmore's secretary began delivering messages. She walked through the building with a stack of printed summons, her face neutral but her hands slightly shaking because she could feel something major was happening. Karen Dempsey received a message to report to the main conference room at 4 p.m. Mandatory attendance. Dr. Whitmore received notice of an emergency board meeting at 4 p.m. Donald Hastings got a call that the board meeting had been moved up, urgent, his presence required immediately. And Trevor was called to the principal's office, told to come with his father, right away, no explanation given. Karen was nervous. In all her years at Lincoln High, she'd never been summoned to a board meeting. Supervisors didn't attend those. Something was wrong. Something big. She paced in the cafeteria, checking her phone, trying to figure out what was happening. Dolores whispered to Margaret, watching Karen's anxiety. Something big is happening. Can you feel it? Margaret removed her hairnet slowly, deliberately. Then her apron. Underneath, she was wearing a professional blouse, silk, expensive, nothing like the plain clothes Maggie Wilson had worn all week. Kevin noticed first. His eyes widened. Maggie, what's going on? Margaret looked at him with a small, knowing smile. The truth, Kevin. Just the truth. The main conference room at Lincoln High was designed for important meetings. Long polished table, leather chairs, portraits of past principals on the walls, windows overlooking the athletic fields. Karen entered nervously and froze. The school board was there. All 7 members sitting in official capacity. Dr. Whitmore was there, looking confused and worried. Donald Hastings was there, already angry without knowing why, demanding to know what this emergency was about. And Trevor sat next to his father, slouching with teenage defiance but with eyes that showed the first flicker of real fear. Then Margaret entered. But not Maggie Wilson. Margaret Williams. Her hair was back to its natural gray, professionally styled, elegant. She wore a tailored suit, charcoal with a crisp white blouse, heels that clicked authoritatively on the tile floor. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with the commanding presence of someone who owned rooms like this. Karen's mouth fell open. What is SHE doing here? The shock, the confusion, the beginning of real fear in Karen's voice was palpable. Margaret walked directly to the head of the table, the power position, and set down her portfolio. The room waited. She let the silence build, let the tension grow, let everyone wonder what was happening. Then she spoke with clear, undeniable authority. Let me properly introduce myself. I'm Margaret Williams, CEO of Hastings Educational Services, the company that manages this school's food program, along with 46 others. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Trevor's face drained of all color, his teenage bravado evaporating as the implications crashed down on him. The lunch lady he'd tormented, the woman he'd thrown food at, the person he'd called nothing, was the CEO of a major corporation. Donald Hastings stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. This is some kind of joke. This is inappropriate. Margaret's voice cut through his bluster like a knife. Sit down, Donald. 2 words. Quiet. Firm. Loaded with authority that came from 3 decades of commanding boardrooms. Donald Hastings, this wealthy, powerful man who'd spent years using his position to control others, sat down. Because the authority in Margaret's voice was absolute and undeniable. Dr. Whitmore stammered, trying to recover, trying to figure out how to manage this situation. Ms. Williams, I had no idea you were, if I'd known, we certainly would have. Margaret interrupted him with cold precision. Clearly. That's why I've been here for 4 days, witnessing everything firsthand. Seeing exactly how this school operates when nobody thinks the CEO is watching. Margaret opened her portfolio and began presenting her findings with the systematic precision of someone who'd built a career on facts and evidence. She turned to Karen first. Karen Dempsey. You are terminated, effective immediately. Criminal charges will be filed for embezzlement of funds totaling $47,312 over a 3-year period. She slid documents across the table, each page showing receipts, invoices, bank records, the complete paper trail of Karen's theft. Karen tried to defend herself, voice rising in panic, claiming there must be mistakes, misunderstandings, that she could explain everything. Margaret cut her off without raising her voice. I have 4 days of documented evidence and 3 years of financial records. You stole from children, Karen. You took money meant to feed students and pocketed it. You created a hostile work environment. You protected bullies and tormented good employees. You're done here. She turned to Dr. Whitmore next. The principal looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Dr. Whitmore, you have 127 unprocessed bullying reports in your office. 127 incidents that you ignored, buried, or destroyed. You've created a culture where abuse thrives and victims have no recourse. The district board will receive my full report, along with legal documentation of your failure to enforce mandatory anti-bullying policies. I'm recommending your immediate suspension pending a comprehensive review of your conduct. Whitmore tried to explain, to justify, to claim he was working within difficult constraints, that he had to balance multiple concerns. Margaret wasn't interested. You had one job. Protect students. You failed. Deliberately. Repeatedly. For years. Then she turned to Donald Hastings, and her voice took on an edge of personal disappointment. Donald, your Uncle Gerald was a good man. He believed business should serve communities, that wealth came with responsibility. He'd be ashamed of what you've become. Your donations don't buy you the right to let your son terrorize students. Our company will no longer service any school where you hold board influence unless you resign from this board immediately. Donald blustered about lawsuits, about contracts, about his family's contributions to education. Margaret's response was calm and devastating. Please do sue me, Donald. I'd love for a court to review your son's documented history of bullying, assault, and harassment. I'd love for the public record to show how you used your position to protect him from consequences. I have emails, meeting minutes, phone records. Please make this public. I'm ready. Finally, Margaret turned to Trevor. Her voice softened slightly, not because she felt sorry for him, but because unlike the adults who'd enabled him, he was still young enough to change. Trevor, you're 17. You're not beyond redemption. But actions have consequences. That's a lesson you should have learned years ago, and it's one you're going to learn now. She pulled out a tablet and brought up video footage from the cafeteria security cameras. The room watched in silence as Trevor threw food on the floor and made Shanice clean it up while filming her. Watched him skip the line, make racist comments, intimidate staff. And then the final video, the one from yesterday, showing Trevor grabbing his tray and throwing it directly at Margaret, food exploding across her face in uniform. The footage was clear, undeniable, damning. Margaret's voice was firm but not cruel. You will be suspended for 10 days, effective immediately. You will complete 100 hours of community service in a food bank, learning what it's like to serve people instead of degrading them. You will attend counseling to address your behavior. And you will apologize sincerely to every person you've hurt. Starting with Marcus Johnson, Shanice, the cafeteria staff, and working through a list I've prepared. Trevor looked at his father desperately, waiting for Donald to fix this like he'd fixed everything else. But Donald couldn't meet his son's eyes. For the first time in Trevor's life, his father's money and influence couldn't protect him. Trevor's voice came out small, uncertain. And if I don't? Margaret's response was clear and final. Then you'll be expelled, and every college you've applied to will receive a full report of your conduct, including this video footage. Your athletic scholarships will evaporate. Your future will be significantly more difficult. The choice is yours, Trevor. Face consequences now and have a chance to become better, or refuse accountability and face much harsher consequences later. The room sat in stunned silence. Karen was crying, her career destroyed, criminal charges looming. Dr. Whitmore looked sick, knowing his professional reputation was in ruins. Donald Hastings was pale and quiet, his power suddenly meaningless. And Trevor was forced to confront, maybe for the first time in his life, that his actions actually mattered. Margaret gathered her documents and prepared to leave. Before she did, she addressed the school board directly. Hastings Educational Services will continue to service Lincoln High School, but under new management and with comprehensive oversight. Dolores Martinez will be promoted to supervisor. Kevin Chin will be trained as assistant manager. Shanice Williams will receive a raise and guaranteed hours. And we'll be implementing strict anti-bullying protocols, not just here but across all 47 of our districts. This stops today. 1 week later, Margaret returned to Lincoln High School. But this time she arrived as herself, Margaret Williams, CO, in a professional suit, walking through the front entrance instead of the service entrance. The cafeteria during lunch was transformed. Not physically, the same tables and chairs, the same serving line. But the atmosphere was completely different. Dolores stood at the supervisor station, wearing her new name tag with pride, greeting students with warmth and authority. Kevin was being trained in management procedures, learning the systems, stepping into leadership with the idealism that hadn't been crushed after all. Shanice was smiling, actually smiling, relaxed for the first time since Margaret had met her. The fear that had haunted her eyes was gone. The food quality had visibly improved. Fresh vegetables. Properly cooked proteins. Portions that met nutritional requirements. Students moved through the line respectfully, saying please and thank you, treating the cafeteria staff like human beings deserving of dignity. Marcus Johnson approached Margaret hesitantly. He'd heard the whole story by now, understood who she really was, what she'd done. Ms. Williams? I just wanted to say thank you. For seeing us. For caring enough to do something. Margaret looked at this brilliant, brave young man and felt her heart swell. You deserve to be seen, Marcus. You always did. Every student deserves that. Don't ever let anyone make you feel invisible again. Then Trevor entered the cafeteria and the room noticed. He was wearing a volunteer vest required for his community service and he looked different. Humbled. Nervous. Uncertain in a way he'd never been before. He was there to serve food, to work alongside the staff he'd tormented, to begin his 100 hours of learning what service actually meant. He approached Margaret and the cafeteria watched. Ms. Williams, I wanted to say I'm sorry. Really sorry. For everything. The apology wasn't perfect. It was awkward, stumbling, clearly difficult for him to deliver. But it was genuine. You could hear it in his voice, see it in his face. This wasn't Trevor performing for an audience. This was a 17-year-old beginning to understand the weight of his actions. Margaret nodded, acknowledging the apology without making it too easy for him. Apologies are a start, Trevor. But changed behavior is what matters. Show me through your actions, not just your words. Trevor nodded, visibly relieved to not be rejected entirely, and went to begin his work in the kitchen. Jessica Rodriguez watched from across the cafeteria. There was hope in her eyes, hope that maybe the boy she'd cared about might actually become someone worthy of that care. Maybe the Trevor who was serving food and apologizing could eventually become someone better than the Trevor who'd thrown trays and made racist comments. Time would tell. If this story moved you and you want to see more content about standing up to injustice and holding people accountable, please subscribe to this channel. Stories like this matter and your support helps us keep telling them. And here's my question for you. Do you believe people like Trevor can truly change, or is 17 too late to undo years of entitlement and cruelty? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments because redemption is complicated and there are no easy answers. Margaret gathered the cafeteria staff privately after lunch service. Dolores, Kevin, Shanice, and 3 other workers who'd survived the toxic environment. She looked at each of them with genuine respect and said something they needed to hear. What happened here was never your fault. You survived in an impossible situation. You kept showing up, kept caring about students, kept doing your jobs with dignity despite being treated terribly. That's real strength. That's real courage. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you were complicit in what happened here. You weren't. You were victims of a broken system and you survived. Dolores started crying, tears streaming down her face, releasing years of pent-up frustration and pain. She hugged Margaret, this woman who'd seen them, who'd believed them, who'd used her power to protect instead of exploit. Thank you. Just thank you. Margaret looked directly out, speaking to everyone watching this story, her voice carrying the weight of experience and conviction. Every person deserves dignity. Every job has value. And every voice matters, whether you're in a boardroom or a cafeteria, whether you're a CEO or a lunch lady, whether you have wealth and power or you're just trying to survive your shift and go home. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't matter because of what you do, where you come from, or what you look like. The final image of Lincoln High School's cafeteria showed students and staff eating together, talking, laughing. The culture had shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. Enough to give hope. Margaret walked out, back to her CEO life, back to boardrooms and corporate decisions. But she was changed too. Reminded of where she came from. Reminded why she'd built Hastings Educational Services in the first place. Reminded that power without compassion is just tyranny, and success without responsibility is just selfishness. The screen faded to text, updating viewers on what happened next. Margaret Williams implemented comprehensive anti-bullying protocols across all 47 districts, creating systems to ensure that what happened at Lincoln High School could never happen again. Marcus Johnson graduated with honors and received a full scholarship to a prestigious university where he's now studying social justice. And Trevor Hastings completed his community service and with ongoing counseling, became an advocate for anti-bullying programs, speaking at schools about the harm he caused and the importance of accountability. Because that's the thing about justice. It's not just about punishment. It's about transformation. It's about creating systems that protect the vulnerable instead of the powerful. It's about using whatever power you have, whether it's a lot or a little, to make the world slightly better than you found it. And sometimes, it's about a lunch lady who was actually a CEO, who remembered what it felt like to be powerless, and who decided that no child should ever feel that way again.